Discover Geography, Lesson 5-4, Gender. Gender is an incredibly important axis of inequality in our society and many others, but it's also a very complex concept. A good way to understand gender is to break it down into three components: physical sex, gender expression, and gender identity. Physical sex refers to the anatomical makeup and functioning of a person's body. So physical sex would cover characteristics like the shape of someone's genitals, the presence of secondary sex characteristics like a beard or breasts, hormones that a person has in their body, chromosomes, XY or XX or other combinations that a person has in their genome. All of these different anatomical features together make up a person's physical sex. And we typically see these characteristics clustering in the same way. We see someone with a nice thick beard like the fellow on the left there, and we can make a pretty accurate guess as to what his genitals are like, what kind of chromosomes he's going to have in his genes, etc. But those things don't always line up in that same way. So we might see someone who has two X chromosomes and who has a vagina and yet still has a lot of hair on their face like you see there. So physical sex can be actually very complicated in how the different parts line up, and any one physical sex characteristic is not necessarily going to be easily distinguished into a male or female type of pattern. If we look, for example, at the anatomical structure that becomes a clitoris in a female or a penis in a male, the difference is largely a matter of its length. And so if the structure is very small, we would consider that a clitoris. We would generally consider the person who has that, assuming all the other characteristics they have are consistent with that, we'd consider that person female. If that structure is very long, we'd say, okay, that's a penis, therefore the person that's on is probably male. And yet there are people whose structure lies somewhere in between there, in this kind of gray zone. And different cultures will interpret these kind of quote-unquote anomalies in different ways. When the different aspects of physical sex don't line up, or when one or more aspect falls somewhere in between what we expect for a male or female pattern. In modern U.S. society, the usual reaction is that this anomaly is something that needs to be fixed, that this is a problem and that we need to alter someone's physical sex. We need to surgically modify their body to make it conform to either the male pattern or the female pattern. So a baby that's born with an anatomical structure whose length is somewhere in between what we'd expect for a clitoris or a penis will usually be subjected to surgery to quote-unquote correct that problem so that they fit nicely into one of those categories. So physical sex has a cultural component to it. How we interpret these various anatomical features and what we do about them has a cultural component, even though the anatomical features themselves are physical characteristics of a person. Gender expression refers to the various behaviors that a person is going to be expected to carry out on the basis of being assigned to a particular gender. So generally, when a baby is born, on the basis of its physical sex, it gets assigned to a particular gender. We look at the baby and we say, it's got a penis, it's a boy. Then on the basis of that, we expect certain types of behaviors from that person. That there will be certain clothing types that are appropriate to a boy, that there will be certain ways of speaking, that there will be certain courses of study and career aspirations that are appropriate. Gender expression is a cultural phenomenon. Culture decides what is an appropriate gender expression for one gender or another. What kind of clothing is male clothing? What kind of clothing is female clothing? What kind of a role within an intimate relationship is a masculine role and what kind of role is a feminine role? And then culture teaches those behaviors to people on the basis of the gender that they're assigned to. You see in the picture there a police officer who looks very masculine in all other respects, putting on some fancy high-heeled shoes, something that we would consider part of a female gender expression. And so this is something that would be treated as an anomaly, as a sort of a source of humor, because he's probably not going to be able to walk very well in that if he doesn't do that very often. And in this particular case, based on where I got this photo from, this individual is wearing these high heels as part of a charity fundraiser walk for a battered women's shelter. So this is something that is outside of what his culture says is appropriate for a man to do, and therefore he's able to do it as kind of a performance. I'm doing something unusual to raise money for this charity. But the assignment of certain characteristics, certain clothing types, certain ways of speaking, certain roles within relationships, certain career choices to certain genders is effectively arbitrary. Different cultures will assign these things in different ways. There's nothing in someone's chromosomes or the shape of their genitals that dictates what kind of clothing they ought to wear, etc. And so if we take something like these high heels that are very clearly seen as part of female gender expression in modern US society, when we look at other social contexts, we look a couple hundred years ago, for example, we find that high heels were seen as a very masculine type of clothing. See in that picture Louis XIV, who was the King of France, wearing some very tall heels. And so in his culture at that time, high heels were seen as a masculine item of clothing. They accentuated men's typically greater height than women. Whereas in our society, we've switched things around, and so high heels have become something feminine. So gender expression is the cultural aspect of gender, and the elements of gender expression are, in a certain sense, arbitrary. They're based on what the culture has decided is going to define the roles of different genders. Finally, gender identity is a person's subjective, that is, from their own perspective sense of where they fit into gender. So when we talk about things being subjective in the social sciences, that doesn't mean that they're fake or that they're merely a matter of opinion or that they're less important. What subjective means is from a person's own perspective. So a subjective idea is one about how a person feels about their own self, as contrasted to something objective, which is something that can be seen by an outside observer. So physical sex is largely objective. You can look at somebody else and see what their physical sex is. You can see their anatomy and verify it from an external perspective. Gender identity is subjective. It's something that only the person themselves can see, but it's no less real. It's a very important part of how people deal with gender. For most people, their gender identity fits in well, matches up with their physical sex and the gender they were assigned to on that basis. And when that happens, we call that condition cis, C-I-S. On the other hand, for some people, their gender identity, their subjective sense of what kind of a person they are and where they should fit into the landscape of gender, does not match their physical sex and or the gender they were assigned to on the basis of that. You might have someone that says, you know, I really feel like I'm a woman, even though my society has told me on the basis of looking at my crotch when I was born, they've told me that I'm a man, but I really feel like I'm actually a woman. That kind of person would be called trans. And so someone who is trans will often attempt to change the way they're viewed by society and or change their physical sex to match their own subjective sense of themselves, to match their own idea of who they really are. Gender takes on a geographical aspect through gendered spaces. We have certain areas of the world that are assigned to certain genders, where certain genders of people belong and fit in, and other genders of people don't fit in the same way. One very common gendered space that we encounter all the time in modern American society is restrooms. So restrooms are divided into male and female in most public places. So this conveys the idea first that we have exactly two gender categories, that everybody can find a restroom in one or the other of these places. Everybody is either male or female, therefore can use either the male or the female restroom. And people of the wrong gender are excluded from those spaces. You can see from this series of pictures of different bathroom signs the many different ways that we convey this idea of gendered spaces. And you can see some of these signs are based on physical sex. So you see some of these signs that are showing or hinting at things like breasts and penises to indicate who belongs where. Others of these signs draw on aspects of gender expression. So they reflect clothing choices that we associate with men or women in order to indicate which space belongs to who. But of course, not everybody fits neatly into the expectations that surround these bathrooms. So someone who doesn't fit neatly into the male or female category may find that they have no bathroom that they can use, that they're excluded from both bathrooms. Trans people often find that they're not welcome in the bathroom that matches their gender identity and which matches their gender expression, because if someone knows that they're trans, they feel like they're in the wrong bathroom. Their identity isn't being respected by the gatekeepers of that bathroom, and so they find that they have nowhere that they can go. Another example of a gendered space would be a football game. This is a typically male gendered space. So this is not a space where women are excluded. It's not as if women aren't allowed to go to a football game. But the type of activity that goes on at a football game is an activity that we associate in our culture with masculinity. We see this as a very manly thing to do, to go to a football game and cheer on the team, to get drunk, to hoot and holler in support of your team, to scream abuse at the refs when they make calls that you don't like, etc. All of these things are considered very masculine sorts of activity. And in fact, if a woman spends enough time going to football games and engaging in this same kind of football fandom that we associate with men, she'll often start to be seen as one of the guys. She'll have taken on a slightly masculine aspect to her identity because of how she participates in that particular space. A very different sort of masculine gendered space would be a corporate boardroom. So here you see a meeting of the board of directors for the Jacksonville Port Authority. And you see that the board sitting around the table in the front is entirely male. And in the audience in the back, you again see mostly men participating in this particular space. And there's no explicit rule that women aren't allowed in a corporate boardroom. But we find that the informal processes that shape who is able to advance and who is able to get into one of these positions tend to disadvantage women, that women are discriminated against, that women find it very hard to walk that fine line in which they project competence so that they can be recognized as deserving to move up through the ranks and get onto the board without being seen as too unfeminine and therefore being treated poorly as a result of that. And this is a very different sort of gendered space than the football game, even though it's also a masculine gendered space. The type of masculinity that's appropriate in a corporate boardroom is going to be very different than the type of masculinity that's appropriate in the stands at a football game. One of the major gendered space divides that we see in our society is the divide between public and private space. Typically, private space, the space of the home and the family, is gendered as female space. We see that as the appropriate space for women to be in control of, for women to have responsibility for women to inhabit. Public space is seen as male space, going out away from the home, out into the working world, into the world of politics and business, is seen as a typically male activity. The divides on this were very explicit in our kind of 1950s household model. When we look at this picture here, we have a clear idea of the wife as the homemaker, taking care of the children, baking the cake for them, and the man as the worker. He goes out and he has the job to earn the money, and then he comes back home to his family where the wife is waiting for him. And we may think that this model is kind of outdated. Very few families these days are able to actually live according to this pattern, are able to actually have this wife as the homemaker, man as the worker kind of model that was promoted in U.S. society in the middle of the last century. And yet, these kind of divides still persist. So here's the results of a survey taken a few years ago about different types of household chores. And within a heterosexual married couple, who is doing each of these kind of chores? And what we see is that laundry is a chore very much associated with private space. It's about taking care of people's intimate clothing within the household, is overwhelmingly done by wives and very rarely done by husbands. On the other hand, yard work, which is a household chore, but it's a more public sort of household chore. It's something that takes place outside of the house where the house can be seen from people passing by, is predominantly done by the husbands and very rarely done by the wives. So this idea that private space is female space and public space is male space continues to persist within our society. And so when we have different spaces assigned to different genders, when certain spaces are the responsibility and the proper domain of one gender versus another, that too can become the basis for environmental injustice. If the distribution of tasks is unjust, or if the conditions in these different spaces are meaningfully different, this can become the basis of claims of environmental injustice. Here we see just one example of the kind of inequalities that can result from this division of public and private space. The graph here shows the wage gap between men and women of each ethnicity within the United States over a period of time. And what we can see is these wage gaps are generally closing over time, and yet there's still a significant gap there. Women, on average, make less money doing the same work as compared to a man doing that same work. And so this is a result largely of this division between public space, the space of business, the space of earning money, income, as being a male role. So men are seen as belonging in those kind of jobs, as being appropriate to those kind of jobs, as needing to earn a good wage to support an entire family, whereas women are seen as not belonging in these kind of jobs to the same degree. And so therefore they're consciously or unconsciously discriminated against in determining salaries. And on this particular graph, we can see some intersectionality at work when we compare the size of the wage gap for different racial and ethnic groups within the United States. And what we see is that overall, the wage gap for whites is actually the largest, whereas people of color, especially blacks and Hispanics, have a smaller gap between men and women in their earnings. And in this particular case, that's largely because white men are able to earn a lot more money than people of any other race or gender. So the higher wage gap between white men and women is largely a result of how much white men are able to earn, because all of these ideas about having a steady job to support a household are very much associated with a white ideal of a proper family. We certainly saw that in the picture of our idealized 1950s household, was shown with white family there. And so you can see here some intersectionality at work, that the way that gendered spaces are affecting people's prospects and lives are in part also a function of those people's race.